Good afternoon. On behalf of the Baha'i Chair for World Peace and the Department of Sociology's Critical Race Initiative, both of which are housed in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, I offer you a very warm welcome to this wonderful symposium on structural racism and the root causes of prejudice. Before I continue to introduce our speakers, I'd like to just thank our BSOS ambassadors. These are volunteers from the college who help us coordinate these activities and make sure that they run smoothly. They welcome you at the door. And I don't know if there may be two of them, but I didn't catch the other one. But one of them is Miss Ali Breder, and I'd like to thank both of them. I think they're in the back. Thank you. And of course, to Dr. Bowman and Dean Jackson, we are honored to have you with us today, and we'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you. Thank you for coming to the University of Maryland. Today's symposium is a part of a series of programs that the Baha'i Chair sponsors with other entities on campus, in particular, in this case, the Critical Race Initiative, on the theme of structural racism and the root causes of prejudice. And the reason for these symposia is for us to try to understand through a scholarly lens the problem of racism in America, and also the problem of racism throughout the world. Racism is considered one of the major barriers, creating a condition that really cannot be conducive to building a better society. It's one of the impediments to a more peaceful world. And therefore, to understand more about what scholarship is telling us about this important issue, I think is extremely important for all of us. So the Baha'i Chair is interested in advancing scientific knowledge about racism with the goal of ultimately applying such knowledge to bring about tangible change through policy and action that impact change at the individual, the community, and institutional level. Our series on structural racism began last spring with a symposium that featured Dr. Lawrence Bobo from Harvard University, Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt from Stanford University, and Dr. Vincent Hutchins from the University of Michigan. And in September of this year, with a lecture delivered by Dr. Eduardo Bonilla Silva from Duke University. These scholars have explored the topic from diverse perspectives and the benefit of a multidisciplinary approach. Today's symposium, featuring the work of two distinguished scholars, is a continuation of this important process of learning and knowledge generating about the vital issue of structural racism. I would now like to ask my dear colleague, Dr. Rayshawn Ray, to please come to the podium and introduce our speakers.
Welcome here this afternoon. I know that it's the middle of the semester, and so oftentimes people have a lot of things going on. So we really appreciate you coming out. It also seems like that it might storm, so I definitely appreciate you being inside. And you're going to definitely enjoy two very, very powerful talks by two very powerful speakers and scholars. First, I just want to acknowledge Dr. Hoda Mahmoudi. Everything that the Critical Race Initiative is doing, a lot of what we've been fortunate to do has been a large part of being affiliated with the Baha'i Chair. And we really appreciate all the work that she's been doing to bring these issues to bear to the University of Maryland community, and really to have us really engage and think about the ways in which race really impacts our society. The first speaker that we have up is Dr. Phillip Bowman, who is the founding director of the National Center for Institutional Diversity at the University of Michigan, which is a national think tank for researchers and other key stakeholders in a social change agenda. He also serves as the principal investigator of the center's Diversity Research and Policy Program. Prior to joining the university, Dr. Bowman served as the director of the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and he's held leadership roles at Northwestern University, including faculty fellow at the Institute for Policy Research, faculty affiliate at the Joint Center for Poverty Research, coordinator of the Spencer Training Grant in Education and Social Policy, coordinator of the Graduate Program in Counseling Psychology, director of the Summer Academic Workshop, director of the Social and Behavioral Science Scholars Program, and interim chair of the Department of African American Studies. And I list all of those things just to have you all kind of understand, and you'll see when I introduce Dr. Jackson a little bit later. These two individuals that we're bringing together today are really going to be talking about and can really speak to the ways in which transformative leadership can take place in institutional settings. So we'll definitely hear those sorts of things. Dr. Bowman's research, and part of what he's very known and famous for, is focusing on diversity issues in research methodology, higher education, and public policy. Trained as a social psychologist, which I'm very excited about and always draw upon his research for that, focusing on racial and ethnic disparities in African American studies. And he's also an active national and international lecturer and consultant on diversity issues. Finally, he's received numerous grants and funding from the National Institute of Mental Health, the National Institute of Aging, and the National Science Foundation. And he's back at the University of Michigan, but he actually received his PhD at the University of Michigan. And he also served as an assistant professor in psychology and Afro-American and African studies. So it's with pleasure that I introduce Dr. Bowman, who's going to be talking about contemporary racism, organizational inequality, and sustainable diversity, challenges for the 21st century.
They gave me instructions. Can people hear? Okay. Okay. It's a pleasure to be invited to this 2014 Baha'i Chair World Peace First Fall Symposium. I've had a great time here in Maryland thus far. Everyone's been extremely hospitable, and I've heard great things about the social behavioral sciences here in particular, including what's going on in African American studies and sociology, in political science and history. And I think this place is doing some very, very cutting edge work. Today, I would like to, as we indicate here, give you a presentation that brings together a focus on contemporary racism, but also links that to issues of organizational inequality and sustainable diversity. As we move further into the 21st century, a growing body of social science research shows how various notions and concepts of contemporary racism have essentially replaced traditional racism in the United States. As indicated by the title of this notion of contemporary racism, or these three notions, organizational inequality and sustainable diversity, in many ways represent very, very different literatures. You know, that you won't hear another talk that puts these three things in the same discussion, so I'm going to do my best. But my view is that it's extremely important to do so, because I argue that their interrelationships can help to better understand what I will call 21st century racism. You know, that is, we're confronted with a set of challenges today where separating contemporary racism from issues of organizational inequality and sustainable diversity will not give us a good sense of the challenges and opportunities that we place in the 21st century. So I'm going to do my best to link them for you today. The overview, I'll first briefly contrast traditional and contemporary racism. Second, I'll make the argument that contemporary racism is necessary, very important construct, but insufficient to explain 21st century racism. Third, what I'll argue is that 21st century racism includes not only contemporary racism, or what we've learned to understand the current stature of contemporary racist beliefs are at the individual level, but also involves very critical organizational and policy issues that we need to begin to think about contemporary racism in those contexts. Finally, I'll highlight some important implications of a multi-level individual, organizational, and policy conceptualization of 21st century racism. Traditional racism includes both bogus science and attitudinal concepts. Traditional racism includes bogus scientific notions about white supremacy and legal segregation, and de facto Jim Crow discrimination. In addition, traditional racism also involves strong negative attitudes about prejudice, stereotypes, that rationalizes blatant discrimination. In contrast, contemporary racism models show how racism has become in the 21st century much less blatant, and much more covert and much more subtle. One example of bogus science is especially provocative, as depicted in this handbill or picture from a handbill, with detailed comparisons of blacks with apes. This handbill, which detailed so-called factual comparisons, was distributed in white communities as late as the 1970s. These types of provocative images not only reinforce traditional prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination, but they were also reinforced by bogus scientific research on black deficits, basically, as all racism, to justify systematic inequality and discrimination. Now, next, I'd like to briefly highlight core dimensions of three major models of contemporary racism: symbolic racism, laissez faire racism, and colorblind racism, that help to explain the persistence of both individual and racial discrimination and inequalities. Racism in general, as I noted earlier, is an ideology of racial domination or exploitation that, one, incorporates beliefs in a particular race's cultural and/or biological inferiority, and two, uses such beliefs to justify the function of racism in all cases, whether it's traditional or contemporary. It's not just to make people feel good or to scapegoat, as you might hear in a lot of psychological literature, but it also functions to justify prescribed inferior or unequal treatment for that group. Laissez-faire racism, which has been advanced by one of the earliest speakers in this series, Lawrence Bobo at Harvard, involves persistent negative multiple dimensions. One, persistent negative stereotyping of African Americans. Two, a tendency to blame blacks themselves for the black-white gap in socioeconomic standing. And thirdly, a dimension that focuses on resistance to meaningful policy efforts to eliminate U.S. racist social conditions and institutions. A broader approach to contemporary racism, and one that purports to be unidimensional, that this is, the notion is that this is the new prejudice, and that even though it's considered a way to look at prejudice that's not blatant, but more subtle and more covert, the manifest content of the items used to measure this construct of symbolic racism has been formalized in terms of four kind of specific themes. One, work ethic and responsibility for outcomes. That is, the sense that blacks' failure to progress results from their unwillingness to work hard enough. Two, excessive demands. That is, the sense that blacks are demanding too much. And thirdly, a denial of continuing racial discrimination. That is, the belief that blacks no longer face much prejudice in society today. And then finally, an undeserved advantage. That is, the sense that blacks have gotten more than they deserve. And this work has been advanced by Sears and his colleagues at UCLA, taking a more traditional psychological prejudice approach to contemporary racism. Colorblind racism is another dimension that's been focused on as a core aspect of contemporary racial ideology, where whites have developed powerful explanations for racial inequalities that essentially exempt them from any responsibility, and usually, by extension, cast the blame on the group of color that the racism is targeted toward. In contrast to Jim Crow racism, Bonilla Silver, who was also I guess a more recent speaker in this series, argues that this ideology explains contemporary racial inequalities as the outcome of non-racial dynamics, and that, two, whites rationalize a minority's status as the product of not race, but market dynamics, naturally occurring phenomenon, or blacks' imputed cultural, not biological, cultural limitations. There's another construct that I've used in some of my work that's, I argue, is also a critical dimension of contemporary racism that I will cast as reactionary racism. Reactionary racism is a core dimension of contemporary racial ideology, which is characterized by, in attitudinal terms, cognitive, emotional, and behavioral components. One, the cognitive belief that whites have lost ground to non-whites because of unfair race-targeted policies or preferences. And the emotional or feeling element that is represented in a resentment toward race-related demands of blacks and other non-whites. Whites often charge blacks with great anger playing a race card in a very strong emotional sense. And then thirdly, a behavioral component that focuses on the readiness to support collective efforts to reverse race-targeted affirmative action policies of the civil rights era. These in this presentation, I'll argue that these three concepts, or these various concepts of contemporary racism are necessary, very important, but not sufficient for a deeper understanding of racial inequalities at the organizational, national, and international level, which I think is called for in the 21st century. These concepts of contemporary racism are necessary because they help explain how individual level attitudes and beliefs explain or determine or help maintain persistent discrimination and inequalities. I'll briefly highlight a related study, and this will give some sense of the utility of these dimensions of contemporary racism in explaining persistent discrimination and inequalities. This particular example is in the context of this study that on racial ideology in the campus community, emerging cross-ethnic differences and challenges, and it also is a way to kind of look at how this plays out in work not only on contemporary racism, but the link between contemporary racism and the anti-affirmative action movement. And this is a movement that most of you are aware has been centered at the national level and is a national movement, especially centered in higher education, and has essentially led to a reversal of affirmative action in Texas, in California, in Washington, in Michigan, in Arizona, and beyond. And this particular study focuses on how core components of contemporary racism helps to explain persistent campus conflicts and also opposition to race-targeted efforts on the college campus, whether it be curricular units like ethnic studies, or whether it be admissions or financial aid. In this particular study, I focus on these dimensions of contemporary racism that's emerged from the literature: reactionary racism, blaming failure on the groups themselves, independent of systemic causation, cultural beliefs about cultural pathology or stereotypes, and this colorblind notion that it's not that I'm against blacks, but I'm just believe in individualism, which is a way to kind of talk about opposition to policies without mentioning race. You'll see that the measures used in this study, all of these things are correlated empirically, which shows that they are part of a broader ideology, but they happen to be particular dimensions because they're not perfectly correlated. And they don't function exactly the same either. This next table basically shows that these types of beliefs create conflicts on college campuses because whites, Asians, Latinos, and blacks differ in the degree to which they agree with these things, with blacks and Latinos essentially scoring less, and with whites and Asians scoring higher on these beliefs. So whether or not they're correct or not, we get big conflicts and differences in the degree to which different ethnic groups in the campus community tend to believe these is true. And that in itself leads to significant, or helps understand significant tensions on campus and why you don't have more engagement and diversity across race and ethnic groups, why they all sit together at the cafeteria, as Beverly Daniels Tatum at Spelman University has said in a very, very popular book. And finally, these are some data that looks at the degree to which these dimensions predict opposition to race-targeted programs on college campuses, including admissions, financial aid, cultural centers, and also opposition to ethnic studies, women's studies, African American studies. And you see that there's the strongest relationship is this resentment, this reactionary racism, very strong. People who believe that tend to be extreme opposition. But you also have the blaming of the ethnic groups themselves, and to a lesser degree, these cultural stereotypes. This literature, when one looks at it together, this literature is essentially similar to other research. These findings support the usefulness of contemporary racism concepts to help explain persistent racial discrimination, conflicts, and inequality. However, the contemporary racism concept, again, I'm arguing here, is insufficient. And to better understand 21st century racism, we also need to focus more on how this contemporary racism operates in organizational settings with other organizational dynamics that reproduce inequality. How contemporary racism operates at the broader national, local level in impeding the strategic analysis of problems in developing policies to promote not only diversity and inclusion, but also sustainable development for the nation state. What's good for cities, what's good for nations. That contemporary racism, I would argue, is impeding productivity at both the organizational level and productivity at the national level, in addition to obstructing the opportunity of African Americans and other people of color from being able to achieve commensurate with their potential. I'll briefly highlight recent work on status characteristics theories. This organizational inequality and sustainable diversity. The organizational inequality, the status characteristics work by Cecilia Ridgway and one of her doctoral students at Stanford here. And you'll notice that this is a different Bowman. It's not P.J. Bowman, but it's J.E. Bowman, who did a dissertation in 2013 on status processes and organizational inequality, the social psychology of inclusion, under the tutelage of Cecilia Ridgway, who this particular article, who's the past president of the American Sociological Association, in this particular article on status characteristics theory, that this argument that I'm going to share with you today, that I think would locate contemporary racism in an organizational framework that could have far more explanatory power to understand 21st century racism. This particular article was published in American Sociological Review this year and was given as her presidential address last year. So these are very accessible. And finally, I'll close this talk by also suggesting the need to understand contemporary racism in the context of current national policy debates, with a focus on sustainable diversity models. This particular citation here is from a book, actually, that I have here. This is one article on sustainable diversity and inequality, race in the U.S. and beyond, that I wrote with a co-author. This was the only chapter in this book by an American. Most of the other chapters in this book that was funded by the European Union was on how these things are playing out in every European Union nation state, France, England, Sweden, and also most other nations in the world. So this question of sustainable diversity is not only a challenge for the U.S., it's a challenge for all nation states in the 21st century that increasingly are confronted with growing racial and ethnic diversity, and along with it, growing racism. that in the context of this discussion, my argument, and I'll kind of show the linkage, is that we need to basically understand how contemporary racism is impeding not only the progress of the racial and ethnic groups, but also competing strategic policy analysis and the formulation of the kind of progressive policy that would be in the interest of economic and sustainable development at the national and urban level, and even within organizations. This particular graphic representation, I won't do justice to the whole status characteristics theory here in the amount of time that I'm given, but I would like to allow you to kind of see how looking at attitudes, racial attitudes, or contemporary racism in the context of such a model would allow us to better understand the backlash that occurred in organizations when you institute diversity initiatives, and that it would give, I think, a lot more explanatory power, the type that we need in the 21st century. First, figure 2 highlights how status characteristics models can provide a deeper understanding of informal group bias in processes that perpetuate inequalities in universities, in workplaces, and in other organizations. As depicted in figure 2, status characteristics theory in general shows how broad macro-level societal racial hierarchies, such as the one that we have in the United States of America, and of course that exist in most nation states when you get racial and ethnic diversity, that you have a power hierarchy. Some people dominate and some people have less power. And related status beliefs, there's related status beliefs at the societal level, that these do two things, that they bias group level processes and they bias individual behavior that reproduce inequalities within organizations. And if you have to change organizations, you will have these processes leading to informal backlash, that will end up resisting change at the organizational level and reproducing the broader macro inequalities within the organization itself. And this graphic representation, which, again, as suggested in figure 2, is based on some work in a recent dissertation by the other Bowman, not myself. It happens to be my daughter, and who's a rising star in this area. I've suggested, that her and her mentor, Cecilia Ridgway, I would strongly suggest, you read their work, because I think, it gives the empirical evidence behind this logic model that I'm trying to advance today. Suggest that contemporary racism attitudes, as you can see in the model, further exacerbates the adverse effects of both the group processes as well as the individual behavior within organizations itself. So I think this kind of model, where you don't look at contemporary racism as a set of individual attitudes in isolation, but you look at them in the context of organizational settings and how they operate to reproduce inequality in organization as predicted by status characteristics theories, and also with very, very clear propositions that I won't go over in detail. These are some more formal definitions which I won't go over in the interest of time about how status characteristics are defined in terms of race, and this work has also been done on gender inequalities and class inequalities and age inequalities. It tends to play out pretty much the same. And also how these status characteristics combine with status beliefs to create these kind of status processes that reflect these culturally driven beliefs about particular groups, leading to informal bias, norms, and organizational inequality in group interaction and performance, which ultimately produces inequality and backlash to change within organization. This literature is guided by a set of very clear propositions to specify how this inequality plays out within organizations, and in turn, there's evidence that contemporary racism exacerbates all of these group and organizational processes to end up better explaining the kind of contemporary perpetuation and continuation and rationalization of racial inequalities in the form of 21st century patterns. The final argument here is that I'd like to highlight a sustainable diversity model that builds on a growing body of cross-national work in the European Union and elsewhere. And it's highlighted in the book in the book chapter in the book that I referred to earlier. This sustainable diversity model can help to explain national policy options under which growing racial and ethnic diversity is more or less sustainable. You know, the whole notion of sustainable diversity is that you can have racial and ethnic diversity that's sustainable, and you can have racial and ethnic diversity that's unsustainable. It depends on how you manage it. It depends on the policies within which this diversity operates. The policy options based on that I'll highlight suggest that contemporary racism, especially the colorblind ideology, impedes strategic policy analysis and also impedes the development of sustainable diversity policy that not only is in the interest of the targeted groups, but is in the interest of sustainable economic development for the nation state. And this is the kind of discourse that's occurring outside the United States. I haven't heard much of it within the United States. And that this is true within the United States and beyond. This particular model, which essentially extracted from the chapter in this book that I wrote, essentially suggests that it kind of lays out essentially 5 policy options: segregation and monocultural assimilation on the one hand, and multicultural pluralism and multi-ethnic empowerment on the other. And in some ways, colorblind ideals is not a policy option. It's a value. It's a goal, but there's no evidence that it's possible in a country that's built on chattel slavery and 100 years of racial segregation. Colorblind is in people's minds, if they wish, but it will not operate in social space. And there's empirical evidence to support that. So, I'd love for it to be colorblind. Martin Luther King dreamed about it being colorblind. But in Mississippi and Chicago, Martin Luther King understood that it wasn't colorblind. So as a policy option, that kind of conceptualization and an argument that it's not only an ideal, but it's an empirical reality, is a denial of reality and impedes the kind of strategic policy analysis that we need in the 21st century. I think if one looks at this kind of paradigm, these kinds of options can be normative, that is, ideals or goals, or one can look at them in terms of the empirical evidence. And the empirical evidence clearly shows that there is still very clear patterns of racial segregation in this country. We need not look further than Ferguson. Right? Is that racial segregation? Yes. We need not look, it's not only Ferguson, it's Detroit, it's Chicago, it's New York, it's DC, LA, and most other locations in this country are still empirically, in fact, what? Racially segregated. So to have a colorblind ideal in the presence of facts that shows that we are facing a need to solve what causes the conflict in Ferguson is not strategic policy analysis. And it will not allow the formulation of policy to address what we see in Ferguson. Likewise, and one can look at the data, a historian looking at the past, a sociologist looking at the present, and pretty much this argument about the inadequacy of colorblind racism to address problem definition and problem analysis as a basis for problem solving in policy terms is indeed a framework within we need to not only juxtapose contemporary racism as something that's bad for the targeted groups, but it's bad for the problem solvers and the managers because they can't solve their problems, they can't manage them without doing a problem definition. Likewise, monocultural pluralism, that in some ways, history teaches us that this has worked in America for WASP, but not even for Jewish Americans has monocultural assimilation worked, and much less for African Americans, Latinos, American Indians, Asian, Middle Easterns, or other non-Europeans. That it is unsustainable. It doesn't work. It creates tensions and conflicts. And it's certainly not the kind of policy that leads to productive diversity management at the organizational level or at the nation-state level that manages your population in such a way for sustainable economic development. Empirical evidence essentially supports this. On the other side, there is a growing movement in Europe to begin to reframe, and we hear again that there's been movement. Of course, in this country, in South Africa, there's much more multicultural pluralism, despite the fact that there's persistent racial segregation and persistent monocultural assimilation, or certainly problems with it. There are also much more pluralism today than there ever has been. But the notion is that it's still more of an ideal than it is empirical reality in the way in which it's played out in the social institutions itself. Likewise, places like the UK embraces multiculturalism as a policy goal, although the facts are racial and ethnic minorities in England are also racially segregated, as they are in the United States. France insists on monocultural assimilation goals, but in fact, the evidence shows that racial segregation is what has to be done there. There's only one country in Europe, and this is by extension, that has embraced a multi-ethnic empowerment agenda to deal with racial segregation, and that's Sweden. And this kind of argument that I'm suggesting now, the policy analysis and policy discourse in Sweden has evolved, and is currently a discussion of contemporary racism in the context of these kinds of policy goals. What I'd like to do is to close this presentation with a focus on a set of research issues and then some conclusions. Research and policy implications. And these are some quotes from this paper that was presented as part of this international discourse. This comprehensive typology has a strong evidence base and builds on extensive social science research on racial and ethnic diversity throughout the 20th century. So these arguments are not my ideas ungrounded in good social science. It's the best social science that basically leads to these kinds of conceptualizations. The comprehensive diversity model can also help guide more meaningful comparative research on related sustainable development issues, including effective management of complex racial and ethnic inequalities, which are often at variance with cherished democratic ideals. You know, we would love it to be colorblind, but it's not. And in some ways, it's that dilemma, the American dilemma, that kind of leads to this problem of contemporary racism as an impediment to strategic policy analysis and sustainable diversity of policy development in the 21st century. As public policy options, the 5 themes in the comprehensive diversity framework can help to clarify conditions under which racial and ethnic diversity is less sustainable under segregation and ignoring ethnic differences, and more sustainable under conditions that emphasize, they recognize and value differences under multicultural pluralism, and also support the empowerment of those groups. That under one, you lead to negative outcomes, tension and conflict. The other one, you lead to positive outcomes, a much more engagement and also productivity in those settings, whether it be an organization or the nation state. In contrast, therefore, to segregation and assimilation strategies, strategies of strategic multicultural and empowerment policies promote more meaningful civic incorporation, engagement, productivity, and excellence. I would like to end this by giving a definition of what I'm calling 21st century racism or a multi-level 21st century racism. It's a multi-level phenomenon where contemporary racism is a part of it, but only a part. Among individuals, reinforce organizational status inequalities and impedes the development of sustainable diversity policy. You know, that definition of contemporary racism is one, I think, that gets at the challenges we face in the 21st century more than one that reduces it to simply individual attitudes. In conclusion, I'm suggesting that this kind of multi-level 21st century racism is not only a challenge for minorities, but for sustainable development in the U.S. and in other nations in a competitive global economy. And those that address this issue are likely to have a competitive advantage in the 21st century. Those that don't will not, because they all will diversify. Because to be competitive in the global economy, not only do you have to deal with the diversity you have, but you have to bring in more at the low skill level and high skill level. You don't get Latinos coming in this country just because they appear here. They're here to do certain work that's creating productivity in this country. You don't get Asian students coming into universities in engineering and business because people like China. You know, it's because it allows the companies to become more competitive in the global economy. It's any nation state in the global economy, England, France, Sweden, is the same phenomena is occurring. You know, the question is how you're going to manage that and the diversity that you already have. I conclude with to excel in the global economy, prosperous nations would need to develop new sustainable diversity policies that not only attract and maintain diverse race and ethnic populations, but also utilize their unique strengths to promote creativity, to promote excellence within the major social institutions. And you can only have sustainable economic development in the long run with such sustainable diversity policy. Thank you.